Okay, so as we begin Sefer Shemos, we are introduced to what we may call the hero of the Torah, Moshe Rabbeinu. And in this week's Parsha, Moshe is shepherding his sheep, and he sees a burning bush. And from the burning bush, the voice of God speaks to him and says, I want you to go and redeem my people. The question is, and this is an important question to ask, why Moshe? Why was Moshe chosen for this task? What actions, what had he done to merit being the hero of Jewish history, the greatest of all the Jews? People like, say, Abraham had himself thrown in a fiery furnace. Abraham discovered God when no one else knew that there was one God and no one else realized it. You could even argue that Yitzchak and Yaakov, maybe on their own merit, maybe by inheriting or taking over the role of their fathers, respectively. But here we have a lot of people who we could have pointed to and made them the leaders. As a matter of fact, at one point, Moshe Rabbeinu argues with Hashem and says, Shlach na biyad tishlach, send by whom you should really be sending by. And our sages tell us he was saying that my brother Aaron is much more fitting than I to have this role. He's involved, he's with the people. I have been shepherding sheep for the last 40 years or so, depending on which medrash you go with. So the answer, invariably, is always going to go back to the little bit about the history of Moshe that we do know before the burning bush. So as you know, the Parsha tells us, and it was in those days, and Moshe grows up, Vayetze el Echav, and he goes out to his brothers, Vayar b'siv losam, and he sees their burden. And he saw an Egyptian man, and he hit him, killed him, and he hit him in the sand. But that opening line, and it was when Moshe grew up, he went out to his brethren, and he saw their burden, that our sages seem to read a lot into it. And here is the language of the Midrash. Again, we should have seen this Midrash inside, but I can say it outside. Vayhi bayamim hahem vayigdal Moshe. Vayetze el Echav, says the Midrash, Shtei yitzios yatsa oso tzadik, twice this great man went out of the palace. But the two incidences are written together. As it says, Vayetze bayom hasheni, and he went out on the second day, Harei shtayim, that's 2 times. I want to stress this. The Torah says, and it was in those days, and Moshe went out to his brethren. And then he kills the Egyptian who sees hitting a Jew. And then the next verse says, Vayetze bayom hasheni, and he went out on the next day. Now, what should the right word be? Should it be Vayetze bayom hasheni? It should be L'macharas, the next day. Vayetze bayom hasheni means he went out the second day. Says the Midrash that this was only the second time that Moshe had left the palace. Not like everyone seems to learn that Moshe was always, like many read into the Parsha, that he was always going out and checking out how the Jews were doing and secretly trying to ease their troubles and their burdens. This Medrash disagrees. This Medrash says that Moshe, on his second day out, was already in trouble for having killed someone on his first day out. Continues the Medrash. Vayar b'siv losam, and he saw their burden. Mahu vayar, what does that mean he saw? Shehaya roeh b'sivlosam, he watched as they worked. Ubocha, and he cried. Va'omar, and he said, Chaval li alechem, I am in pain for you. Mi yitain musi alechem, who would give me death in your place? She'ein lecha malacha kasher v'melachas atit, for there is no more difficult work than working in the lime, in the mud. V'haya nosink seifov, and so he put his shoulder in. U'misayeya l'chal echad ve'echad mehem, and he would help each person work. On his first day out, Moshe Rabbeinu couldn't handle watching these people, how difficult they were working, and so he, the Prince of Egypt, is out there helping people carry things.
Did he keep in contact with his family? Like, did he know? I mean, yes, he was 3 years old when he was weaned, but after that, there's not a lot you're usually...
It seems like he did. It seems like even there, I mean, 3 years old, especially for the prophets, 3 years old is already an old age. Look at what Rivka was doing when she was 3 years old. So it does seem that Moshe was wise beyond his years, and at 3 years old he could have gathered exactly what happened. And at least as a prince, as he's usually referred to by the world, the Prince of Egypt, but as someone who is living in the palace, he certainly would have had the power to have visited his family whenever he wanted, but always making sure that no one would realize that he knows that that's his real family. Says the Medrash goes on, Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu, says the Holy One, blessed is He, Ata hinachta asakecha, you left your business, your whatever you should have been doing. V'halachta liros b'tzaron shel Yisrael, and you went to look into the pain of the Jewish people. V'nahagta b'hem minag achim, and you behaved with them like brothers. Ani maniach es elyonim es tachtonim, I will abandon my domains, my palaces, my special places. V'adaber imcha, and I'm going to come and speak to you directly. As we know, the messenger, the shaliach, the one who's supposed to bring down the Torah, cannot be bringing us the Torah of things he sees in a dream. That has to be panim el panim. Tmunas Hashem yabit. That has to be a direct communication between God and the prophet. Hashem says, who's more deserving of me to come down from my private domain and have direct communication with him as a human being than the one who lives in the palace and leaves his grandeur and prestige and goes and looks into and connects to the pain of my children. Hadahu d'chsiv ayar Hashem kisar liros. Hashem saw that he turned to see. Fascinating pshat, says the Medrash. This is an unbelievable pshat. Because if you look in the verses later, the Torah says that Moshe saw the burning bush and he turned to look at it. Asura nave'era. And he said, I'm going to look at this and see what's going on. And Hashem saw kisar liros, that he turned to see. He says, Moshe, stop, take your shoes off. So says the Medrash, no, you're missing. That's not what it means. It's not that Hashem saw that he was looking at the bush. Hashem says to him, you're the one who turned, who left your palace, and you went to look into the state of your brethren, and so therefore you're the one that I'm going to speak to. Lefikach vayikra elav Elokim mitoch hasneh. Therefore, Hashem speaks directly, directly to Moshe through the sneh, because at that point Moshe had earned the right to be the leader of the Jewish people. So this Medrash is trying to ask the question, why Moshe? Except the Medrash gives an interesting answer. That's not what I would have said. I would have said, especially like the other Midrashim learn, that he was out there year after year after year, constantly fighting for the Jewish people. That showed a leadership on his part, and therefore he would be fitting as the leader. Or the other Midrashim that say, because he risked his life to kill the Egyptian, and he knew that came with death penalty, that's pretty good too. But this Medrash understands, no, that's not it. It's the leaving of the palace and moving down into Egypt and he only did it one time, 2 times. It was only a matter of hours that he was out there, and that's it. He's merited, not only has he merited to be a prophet and the leader of the Jewish people, but v'lo kam od b'Yisrael, there would never rise a prophet like Moshe who spoke to Hashem panim b'panim, face to face. Why? Because of this incident. Asks Rabbeinu Yerucham these words, Advarim temeim. This is incomprehensible. These actions are no big deal. This is not such a big deal. It was a matter of a few hours. It was a matter of a couple of days. So because of this, Yizge b'schar ein sof, he gets the ultimate reward to be the greatest prophet of all time. There should be a higher charge for that. And this leads Rabbi Yerucham in Das Torah to make a suggestion which I think is very important to us. And here's the question I'd like to present it. I'd like to present it in the form of a question. Every one of us has life goals. Everyone has plans for what you'd like to do. Those plans are always going to be based on where society at large expects different people to be or to reach. In other words, I live in a community, and in this community, this is the typical path, or this is the average. And so now I have to figure out, do I want to be exactly in the middle? Do I want to be a little bit more, a little bit less? That's generally how most of us do it. I'm a Jew at this level of observance, and so here's what I'm going to do in my place. That's typically how most people measure themselves. And not just there, but just in general. If, let's say, when it comes to a person's health, so what do? I take out the book which tells me how much the average person, how healthy they should be, and I say, listen, as long as I'm within the middle range, or maybe even a little bit towards the higher side, just to create a sort of buffer, I'm good. Rabbi Yerucham says that that's a mistake. That's a mistake because you're using standards that are man-made. Instead, what we have to ask ourselves is, based on the abilities that God gave me, where am I? Based on my potential, what have I accomplished? What am I accomplishing? What will I accomplish? And that's going to put us, or give us a responsibility that's going to be very different than just relying on, based on where my friends and peers and co-workers and colleagues and family relatives are, I'm doing pretty good. The measure of someone great is not someone who does more than other people. The measure of someone great is the person who knows what they are, who they are, and becomes the best person that they could possibly be. A powerful lesson from Rabbi Yerucham. So he says, Moshe Rabbeinu did not, as he'll explain, the power of Moshe is that he didn't say to himself, in my position, I can fight for the Jewish people as a minister, as someone who's in the palace, which the Medrash tells us he did. Right? The Medrash tells us that he went to Pharaoh and he said, these people are all, you're overworking them, you're doing yourself a disservice. And so he convinced Pharaoh to give the Jewish people 1 day a week off. And Paro agreed, and actually they found that the work was increasing. The workload, people were doing better. Paro was very excited about it. Moshe didn't look like he was working for the Jews. And as it turns out, the Medrash tells us that later, when Hashem says, Zachor es yom ha-Shabbos lekacho, remember the day of Shabbos, or when it was given in Mara, and Moshe said, really? There's a day of rest? Which day of rest is it? And Hashem says, well, it's the 7th day of the week. And Moshe said, that's the day I happen to have chosen for the Jewish people. And the Medrash says, that's why on Shabbos we say in our davening, Yismach Moshe b'matnas chelko. Moshe rejoices in the gift of his portion. Says the Medrash, that's because Shabbos was actually Moshe's initiation, because he happened on that day, the exact day that Hashem would choose for the Jewish people. So Moshe could have settled for that. Within the rules, within the system, that's what he could have done. But Moshe asks himself, he says, well, what about, that's very good in general, but what about that guy who is weighed down by this brick or this pile of mortar that he's carrying, or this bucket filled with mud or lime that he's carrying? I could be out there too. I'm not limited by the standards I've created myself, by these limitations. And so whatever he could do, he could do. That ability to say to himself, I'm doing plenty, but I'm still not doing enough, that's the greatness of Moshe Rabbeinu. And because of that, says Rabbi Rucham, he becomes the greatest prophet of all time, because as long as there was still more place to climb, Moshe was ready to climb. And the thing is, you could be there too. If I could be there, we could all be there. If we would just say to ourselves, what more could I do? What more can I... Again, I don't want anyone to feel guilty about this and say, well, that means I've wasted my life. Look at all the things I haven't done. Or, worse yet, to say, that's it. From now on, I'm no longer talking to people. I'm just going to spend the rest of my life volunteering for the Red Cross. That's also not good. Again, it's got to be balanced. Right? When you get to that level where you're speaking to God directly, then you have to worry about separating from the wife and where your attention should be and all those other issues. Until then, we have lives to live on. We have plenty of mitzvahs that we have to fulfill, plenty of good deeds that we have to do within the lives that we live. However, asking ourselves, and that's what Rabbi Rucham wants us to do, he's telling us that the greatness of Moshe Rabbeinu, the great leader of the Jewish people, is that person who had no limitations on himself, who never gave himself a pat on the back and said, not bad, pretty good for a day's work. So, to expand on this, he quotes an interesting midrash. There's a verse in Mishlei, a lot of wisdom in Mishlei. It's called the Book of Proverbs for a reason. And there's a great line in Mishlei that says, O lazy man, go you to the ant, see its ways and become wise. It has no officer over it. It has no ruler. And yet, in the summer it prepares its bread, and it gathers during the harvest its food. Everyone knows Aesop's fable with the ant and the grasshopper. That grasshopper who refuses to do any gathering, and then he ends up freezing through the winter, while the ant who collects lives. Says the Midrash, Ma ra Shlomo lelamid la'atzel min anamolo. What lesson is the lazy person supposed to learn from an ant? Say the rabbis, the ant has 3 chambers in its, what is that, farm? Call it an ant farm. I don't think it's called an ant farm in real life. But the colony is the whole group of people. But in its structure, there are 3 chambers. It doesn't go into the top chamber because the top chamber is made to catch the water. It doesn't go into the bottom chamber because that fills up with mud. It lives in the bottom chamber. And the ant, again, this is Talmudic science. I'm not sure whether it fits, but let's just go with this. It only lives for 6 months because any animal that's that simple, says the Midrash, only lives about 6 months. all an animal eats its entire life is the equivalent of 1.5 kernels of wheat. And yet, it gathers and gathers and gathers and gathers as much as it can in wheat and barley and lentils. Says Rabbi Tanchuma, if all its life, all it eats is 1.5 kernels of wheat, why would it gather so much more?
For the other ones.
What?
For the other ones.
But each one should only gather 1 kernel of wheat.
This way you're safe if half the kernels are blown away or...
Interesting. Away. So this is what the Medrash says. Because the ant says, what if Hashem gives me more life?
Yeah, right. The ant's really thinking this.
Well, but the thing is, we're saying that's what it's gathering for. In other words, even if the ant doesn't actually have that thought, maybe Hashem gives me more life, but it's gathering because it knows it needs food. So it doesn't make that calculation of how long it's going to live.
Or
it's
how
just
much it eats.
Right. Says Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, there was an incident, and they found that one ant had collected 300 kur, some ridiculous amount. Therefore, says Shlomo, you lazy one, go you to the ant and learn its ways and become wise. Prepare in this world for the next world.
Or collect the ant's food and eat it.
Well, an ant's food isn't going to cover you. Says the Gemara, okay, that explains why the lazy person should go to the ant and see its ways. But what is so wise about it? What's the wisdom? So the rabbis explained that ants will not steal. Rabbi Shimon Bar Chalafta said, I once did a study. Apparently he sat there on the ground and did some ant watching. He says, I saw an ant that dropped a kernel of wheat. And all the other ants came and they would put their antennas to it, so to speak, to sniff it, and none of them took it. This was someone else's ant. Some other ant's kernel. Later that ant returned, found its kernel, and took it.
Why did you leave in the first place?
We don't
know that, huh?
Maybe his wife called him home for something. So says the Medrash, what's amazing, and that's the point that Shlomo Malach is making in Proverbs, is that no one taught this to the ant. No one's watching over the ant. There's no officers, there's no police officers. If one of the ants tries to steal, that would catch it and it would go to prison. And yet, this is the way that they behave. Asks Rabbi Yerucham. He says, one second. Let me try to make sense of this. We're supposed to learn from the ant. The lazy person is supposed to learn from the ant. On the contrary, the lazy person should learn from the ant that you shouldn't do any work. Look at this ant. He's wasting his time. He's doing all this work, and all he gets is 1.5 kernels. So that proves the lazy person, on the contrary, the lazy person should say, well, then that means that there's no point in putting in all this effort. Couldn't the lazy person use that same lesson of the ant to learn to be lazy? Says Rabbi Yerucham, because the lesson isn't what the ant accomplishes. The lesson is that when you see an animal that's hardwired to just do work, that shows you what the potential of what you could accomplish in life. We're not trying to get you to copy the actions of the ant. We're trying to say to you, think about you had that same attitude, where you would be right now. It's not about the calculations that the ant makes, but just saying to yourself, you have 12 hours in a day, or 18 hours in a day, depending on how much. What are you doing during that time? What are you accomplishing? And lech etzel namala, go to the ant and see how much the possibilities are, if someone really wanted to, what they could accomplish. Furthermore, he says, the lesson of the ants not stealing is, how does the ant, why does the ant not take a kernel of wheat that belongs to another ant? There is no officer, there's no court system, there's no one that's going to catch them. And the answer is, again, speaking from a very scientific point of view, because that's the way that they are hardwired. That is their instinct, that's the way they were set up that way. So he says, Yerucham, this is all telling you that who you are and what you accomplish is based on what you turn your hardwiring into, what you make into your nature. This is a very, very important lesson. I'd like to spend a few minutes on this because we've got two different kinds of people who accomplish things. People who accomplish things because they're forced by stress and by deadlines and by circumstance to accomplish things. And then there's people who are just go-getters, people who do, people who accomplish, people who get things done. And what Rabbi Yerucham says is that most people think that you're born one way or the other. I'm either born a lazy person who doesn't really get much done, and you know what, I do what I can. Right? Like the Terry Pratchett, the famous author, writes that there was once a person that was so lazy, he used to work out 3 hours every morning. He was so lazy that he worked out 3 hours every morning so that if anyone would ever ask him to help carry something, it wouldn't be hard.
That was why he did it?
Yes. Laziness, some people think that, you're born lazy, your nature is to be lazy. And then there's other people, what can I do? That person just seems to have a spring in their step. That person seems to be bouncy. They were made that way, so I made this way. All of that is, again, falling back into the rules that we've created for ourselves based on the way society describes things, based on the way... But if you want to accomplish, we have a rule that we say, Ein lecha davar ha'omed b'fnei haratzon, which translates most literally as, there is nothing that can stand in the way of one's will. Mind over matter, there is nothing that cannot be accomplished. Like to think that if a person, let's use the example of a language. Many people say, I'm not good at languages. If you needed to, you could learn any foreign language. Let's give it 6 months. There isn't a single person in this room who couldn't learn a foreign language in 6 months. I'm not saying that anyone should. I'm not saying there's any reason. What?
Except German.
Well, yeah. The question is whether you would want to.
Right.
But you could. So when we think about the potential of what we're capable of, and we don't do it, it gets boring, whatever, that's fine. You don't have to. I'm not saying there's any reason to learn a language, or to learn a craft, or to learn a talent, or to learn how to juggle, and these are mundane things that don't necessarily change your life. All the languages maybe, but you could finish a certain number of books, you could all this, and yet when we look back, and we look through what we're generally doing, and we ask ourselves, so what have we accomplished? What have we accomplished in the last 24 hours? What have we accomplished in the last week? What have we accomplished in the last month? What have we accomplished in the last year? Says Yerucham, again, this is motivation here. Not no one. If this leads to guilt, you're missing the whole point. This is just saying to ourselves that lesson of the ant is the lesson that you can take these concepts, the go-getter type of attitude, you can create that and make that into your nature. If a person has difficulty waking up in the morning, that's just a matter of something they need to get over, you can work that out if you chose to. If there was enough will, you could work that out. If a person, anything you want to. Now, everyone has their limitations. There is absolutely no way that any of us will learn to run faster than I think we're all past the point where we'll be able to do the 10-second, 100-meter dash. I think we can, but we can all, within our means, within what's allowed by our physical bodies, all of us could accomplish those things. And that's the lesson of Shlomo Melech. Look at the ant, and beautiful way that Rabbi Yerucham is putting it from two perspectives. Number one, see how it doesn't make the calculations of what its limitations are and what it needs. It just says, if this is what I can potentially accomplish, that's what I'm going to do, regardless of whether I see purpose or want or means. And secondly, that if you really want to, you can turn this into some kind of nature. You can make this into a second nature. So he says, the greatness of Moshe Rabbeinu, and these are the words of Rabbi Yerucham. He says, how is he not afraid of Paro? How did he put himself in danger in killing the Egyptian? How does he stand up against the shepherds who are stopping the daughters of Yisrael from collecting? Who does he think? What about, why isn't he? He's a stranger. He's running away. He's on the run. There's probably wanted signs in all the post offices with Moshe's face on it. And here he is fighting for these strangers who he'd never met before. Because Moshe Rabbeinu was the kind of person who didn't make rules for himself based on the way that other people place limitations on themselves and say to themselves, this is my role in life, that's how much I should accomplish. So he says this helps us explain the Medrash says, "Vayinaheg esatzon achar hamidbar," and Moshe led his sheep far into the wilderness. So the Medrash says, why far? K'dei larchikan min hagezel, to keep them away from other people's fields, to keep them away from stealing. So the question is, you don't have to go far away. You don't have to go far away to avoid stealing. Just keep them out of other people's fields. In the wilderness, according to some, Midian is east of the Red Sea, and Sinai is west of the Red Sea. So Moshe Rabbeinu actually leads his sheep up the Arabian Peninsula, which is where Midian was, according to one opinion. Let's take that opinion. Either way, it was east of that area, into the Sinai Peninsula, and down where he sees the burning bush is actually on Har Hashem, which is Chorev, at Har Sinai. He is leading them a very, very far distance out of where nobody lives. What would be later the greatest example of walking through the wilderness. That's where he's leading them, because he doesn't want to steal. So says Rabbi Yerucham, I think he says, this proves my point. Moshe Rabbeinu doesn't know of limitations. I'm just going to take them as far as they'll go. Just go to the furthest place, and that's where I'm going. With this we can understand, again, Rabbi Yerucham says, an amazing teaching, which I'm sure you've heard, and we've discussed this before, and this is something which we have to come back to every year. Hashem says to Moshe, the first plague is going to be turning the water of Egypt into blood. The second plague was bringing out the frogs, and the third plague was hitting the land, and the earth itself turned to lice. And everybody knows that the first three plagues were not performed by Moshe, but they were performed by Aaron. Why? So Rashi tells us this, any day school child can tell you this, because since Moshe benefited from the river, Moshe was saved by being placed in a basket in the river, so therefore he couldn't be the one to hit the river. Similarly, he hid the Egyptian which he killed in the sand, which actually only gave him about 24 hours of protection, as it turns out, because someone saw him kill the Egyptian anyway. But still, it protected him for a while, and therefore he could not fail in gratitude towards the sand. And therefore, those three plagues were performed by Aaron. And Every time you read this, you ask the same question again. They're inanimate objects. Even the common answer is, well, it's for us. But still, you have to show gratitude to someone. Who are you showing gratitude to? So there's many answers to this question. But Rabbi Yerucham says, you don't need to answer the question. You're missing the point. Moshe Rabbeinu doesn't ask these kinds of questions. Because Moshe says, if I will show appreciation to a river, I will show appreciation to a rock, I will show appreciation to sand. Because if I'm feeling that gratitude, I'm going to act it out, because the rules that we've created for ourselves, for what's considered moral and what's not considered moral, and how far I need to push myself for someone, and how far I need to do for someone else, those rules are all made up by us based on limitations we've said. So, for example, let's take an example. Some of us, I have to be careful with this, because I don't want anyone to accuse me of, let me say it first and then I'll. You're supposed to do for people. Everyone here knows that if people ask you for favors, you're supposed to do for them. Then you've got some people who, once you do a favor for them, it becomes an obligation. First of all, you now owe them that favor because you did it once. Not only that, but that means that somehow you've enslaved yourself to them, because every time they need anything similar to this, they're now going to come to you and expect that kind of help. And then they might even be upset with you if at any point you don't do something for them. Everyone's got people like this, and maybe we ourselves even sometimes do this. And everyone's heard the expression, you don't have to be a doormat. Right? You're not supposed to let people walk over you. You're supposed to be balanced. You're supposed to be somewhat more, stand up for yourself a little bit. So we've created those rules based on the golden mean, which I think it's really correct to say that. But you know what? Maybe I should do a little more. If I am able to, maybe I should push myself. Maybe those definitions for what is expected of me, what's not expected of me, it goes, and that's why I'm worried that someone's going to say, well, that means that I'm saying that there should be no golden mean, that we shouldn't be on the middle line. No, there should be a middle line. But you can do beyond that anyway. Or maybe you should adjust where you believe the middle line is. Because we are actually working with morals that our society says for us, that you're supposed to have 6 weeks of vacation, you're supposed to have a certain amount of time that you have off per day, all these numbers that we've and because our society has that, because our society has said that every person needs to have a certain amount of this and a certain amount of that, so we've allowed ourselves to accept those and call those a part of our golden mean. And Rabbi Yerucham wants us to question some of that. Some of these givens that we've created, which are limitations in terms of the responsibility we have to question that a little bit. And he wants us to question it a lot. I think that Rabbi Yerucham is one of the greatest Bali Musar of the last 100 years, and so for him to question a lot, I think what we can ask of us is to question a little bit and just say to ourselves, so are we pushing ourselves like that? Have we, because of maybe laziness, so we create these lines and say, well, this is how much I'm expected, this is how much I need to do. And ask ourselves, maybe we could do a little more. And I love the example that he uses here, not that he needs my haskama, but this example of Moshe Rabbeinu showing appreciation to inanimate objects shows you that it's not just in terms of action, but it's in terms of attitude. Just the way that you approach things and say, okay, yeah, the rock can't understand it, can't appreciate it, but I'm going to do it anyway. So I want to go back to one final point with Moshe because I think it ties it all together. But I want to get to the main lesson of Rabbi Yerucham. And here's powerful words that he says. He says, we have 613 commandments. And the Torah is big enough. So someone might easily say, I'm going to do exactly as the Torah instructs me. I'm only going to do what the Torah instructs me. And whatever does not fall within the obligation of the Torah, I'm not required to do. So he says, there were many people who asked Rabbi Yisrael Salanter. Rabbi Yisrael Salanter was the founder of the Musar movement. And he inspired people to, I guess you could say, probably the following story, more than any other, represents who Rabbi Yisrael Salanter was. Rabbi Yisrael Salanter once obligated himself to pay money in a case where he was exempt, where he didn't need to. And he was challenged by someone who said to him, where is this obligation written? And that's a big, big excuse that people, show me where it says. Show me where it says you have to do this. That show me where it says means, if it's not in black and white, if it doesn't say somewhere that if I don't do this, I'm going to burn, then I'm not going to bother. I want to do the bare minimum. To which Rabbi Yisrael Salanter's response was, my Choshen Mishpat, meaning my law book of financial law, is bigger than yours. And in my book it's written. Meaning, stop trying to find the least that you can do. Stop trying to say, well, it doesn't say I have to do this. And say to yourself, what am I capable of doing? How much can I really accomplish? And I want to raise this as, our class is, the theme here is ethical dilemmas. And this really does create a dilemma, because ethics tells you that you're not supposed to go beyond the golden mean. That's what we're taught. And somehow we realize that even though you're supposed to balance everything out perfectly, nevertheless, those who don't balance things out are the Moshe Rabbeinus. Those are the people who end up being the leaders and the giants of the Jewish people. If you look at the stories of the great people in Jewish history, it's always people, I'm not just talking about the great rabbis who accomplished great things in their learning, but even the great philanthropists and the other people who went out of their way in terms of politics, in terms of just all the things which they did for the sake of the Jewish people. Take a look at their stories, and you'll see almost all the stories of their greatness, are stories of how they went beyond what the expectation was, how they did something which no one else would have expected them to do. That's always what the story is. So yeah, you can follow the golden mean, and I don't have the answer for where do you draw that line, and what tells me that I should be of those people or of those people. I don't know that, but that's what he's saying is expected of us to do on some level. So this leads us to the last medrash that we're going to mention tonight. The medrash says, Hashem tzadik yivchan. Hashem tests the tzadik. How is the tzadik tested? B'maratzon, with the shepherding of sheep. Our sages tell us, this is a beautiful medrash. When Moshe Rabbeinu was shepherding the sheep of Yisro in the wilderness, a small goat fled from him, and he chased it. He chased it, and he chased it, and he chased it, until it came to a brook of flowing water. And the goat, this little kid, bent down to drink the water. When Moshe catches up to the kid, he says, I did not know that you were thirsty. All this time he thought the kid was a troublemaker, was fleeing for some madness. And he sees that the goat was thirsting, and somehow it felt animals have this intuition or greater level of senses, whatever it was, the goat knew how to find the water. And so Moshe realized that this goat had been running thirsty all this time. And so he lifts up the goat on his shoulders and carries the goat back. Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu, says the Holy One, blessed is He, you have mercy to lead the sheep of a man in this way. By your life, you will be the shepherd of my sheep. And that's why it says, Moshe hayaroa, Moshe was shepherding the sheep, and then Hashem appears to him and says to him, that I want you to go and take the Jewish people out of Mitzrayim. So, Yerucham ties all this together, all the stories of Moshe. All the stories of Moshe. Usually we talk about this story, and we talk about how loving Moshe was, how caring he was for each individual kid and sheep in the flock. That's true. But he's saying, but that's caring, that's loving, that doesn't make you the world's greatest prophet. It's not just that Moshe cares. It's that Moshe is refusing to put limitations on how much he cares. He refuses to say, well, I'm not going to chase for 10 miles, 20 miles, whatever it was. Maybe it was only a few thousand feet. Whatever it was. He could have said, I don't have to exert myself. And then when he sees the kid was thirsty and he carries it all the way back, when it could have walked, it had just drank the water. It was no longer thirsty. But Moshe doesn't have limits because Moshe is going to push himself. His mercy is going to be as far as his heart will allow him to love and to care. That's the greatness of Moshe. The greatness of Moshe is that he has no limitations. He says, the people who always say, where does it say I have to do this? Why do I have to? I'm fulfilling my obligation. I want to use examples, but I don't want to use examples because if I use the examples, first of all, it becomes about those examples, but also it sort of loses the opportunity for us to create our own examples. To say, where in our lives do we say, well, that's all that's expected of me, that's all. I'm going to use one example anyway. I'll be general, just to. When it comes to, let's say, eating a Shabbos meal, so I sometimes hear people say that, I can't, I'm unable to eat that much. So obviously a person doesn't have to overeat, but if the obligation is, in terms of halacha, that a person should be able to eat a certain amount or a certain number of meals, I'm trying to avoid the specific examples. So again, if it's a health issue, on the contrary, you're supposed to be more stringent with your health. And so no one should ever endanger their health. But if it's just a matter of convenience and what works out for me and how I can fit my schedule of my resting along with my schedule of my eating so that things are convenient for me, and that's okay, because technically there's an opinion that says that you can do this with this and you can do this with that, and all day long we can do this in terms of the davening. Well, as long as you said all the words, you can, just pushing ourselves and saying, well, maybe we should question, and maybe we can do more, and to try to, I don't use the words, go beyond what the typical limitations are. But what we're talking about here is shifting and changing from being of those people who only get through life and cover all the bases versus someone who accomplishes and does in their life. And I don't want to be morbid by saying that, how much will a person accomplish over their lifetime? That's a very difficult question for anyone to ask. We don't have to focus. We don't have to see this as a negative thing. I don't think Rabbi Yerucham wants us to look at it that way. But I want to bring this, I only have a couple of minutes left, so I want to focus this back in terms of Moshe Rabbeinu and his greatness. If we're saying that who we are is not based on what we accomplish by the standards of the world. Who we really are is what we accomplish based on our potential. And what we're saying is that the greatness of Moshe, and the reason why he becomes the greatest prophet, is because he pushes himself to achieve his greatest potential. And any person's greatest potential is going to be attaining the level of speaking directly to God, because if you perfect yourself in that way. Moshe Rabbeinu lives to 120 years. And whenever we bless someone, they should have long life, we say, you should live to 120 years. And the question is, it doesn't say anywhere that a person is only supposed to live to 120 years. Yeah, there is a verse in Parshas Bereshis that says that because the lifespan of man is 120 years, but it doesn't mean that you can't live more. I'll prove this to you. Because after the Torah says the lifespan of man should be 120 years, Avram lives to 175, and Yitzchak lives to 180, and Yaakov lives to 147. They all lived longer lives than 120, so then why do we give someone a blessing that they should live to 120? And one of the answers is that what we're saying to someone is that you should live a life of attainment and accomplishment. And the greatest example of someone who attained the most possible, who attained the greatest amount relative to their capability, is Moshe. The Torah ends with V'zos habracha sheberach Moshe ish ha'elokim. By the time the Torah ends, he starts off in this week's parsha, he's referred to as Ish Mitzri, an Egyptian man. And by the time the Torah ends, he's referred to as Isha Elokim, a man who's borderline angel. Because Moshe doesn't even die because his lifespan ends. He dies because he reached the end of human accomplishment and he steps into heaven. We have trouble because we're so far from that door to heaven that they have to pull us kicking and screaming. But Moshe traveled. If the distance between here and heaven is 120 years, as we see from Moshe, so he walked the whole time. We keep taking breaks, very long breaks. So I'm going to leave this as a question. We're out of time, so I'm going to leave this as a question and say to us, and maybe if you have thoughts on this, please, if you would be willing to share it. So how do we resolve this? How do I figure out which things I'm supposed to say, this I need to give it the golden mean, this is where I need to take the middle path, this is where I need to be average, and where are those places? What are my signs to know that this is the area? When it comes to appreciation, like Moshe appreciating the sand and the river, should it be in terms of how much love he's willing to give, like Moshe is willing to give to the sheep? Is it in terms of how much a person gathers, such as the ant? Is it in how careful we should be to avoid other people's money, like in the case of the ant or like in the case of Rabbi Yisrael Salanter? Where are those areas? You've got to imagine that Rabbi Yisrael Salanter could not have gone to the extreme in all 613 commandments, because it would be impossible to live a life like that. So how do I figure that out? What are those lines? I don't know if I can answer that question, or if any one of us could really answer the question in general. But I do think that every one of us can find that answer for ourselves. And maybe when we think about the lesson of Moshe, when we say, Moshe had the same difficulties we have. Maybe Moshe also, when he was young, had trouble getting up in the morning, or maybe Moshe also had trouble, wanting that extra slice of cake at the end of the meal. We don't know what Moshe Rabbeinu's struggles were as a person, but Moshe Rabbeinu knew no limitations. May we merit, if we learn these parashas, and maybe we'll come back to this a little bit, but as we learn these parashas, we're supposed to look up at Moshe Rabbeinu, and we're supposed to say to ourselves, what can I do? What can I do to become a part and connect to this, the greatest of the Jewish people? And in what way can I make myself better and accomplish more? Not just in terms of more names and more plaques and more recognition, but just in terms of accomplishment of self, having a life and making use of it. Hopefully we can merit to do as best as we can, and Hashem should help us every step of the way. Thank you.